The Alabama Booksmith presents Author Spotlight. Because every book in our store is signed, our wall of fame displays a breathtaking array of writers and signatures. Close-up shots reveal giants of literature, acclaimed historians, stars of stage and screen, our nation's leaders, famous sports heroes, and thousands of other esteemed authors. Today's Wall of Fame guest is Gregoey Maguire, who will discuss his new book, A Wild Winter Swan. And here is Gregoey Maguire with our host, Jake Reese.
Welcome. We are honored to chat today with one of America's great storytellers, joining us from his home in Massachusetts. Gregoey Maguire, how things up your way?
Well, Jake, it's nice to meet you, and I'm happy to say we are enjoying a little rain today. We have been experiencing terrible drought in this neck of the woods, and this is only the second rain in the last, 14 weeks. So it's very welcome. And I'm glad to be here with you, and I'm glad to make my first footstep into Alabama, even cybernetically. I don't believe I've ever been there.
Well, we hope to fix that when your next book comes out and get you down here to Alabama in person. Just in case there's anyone watching from another planet, let me take a moment to tell our audience a little about this literary superstar. While best known for Wicked, the blockbuster Tony Award-winning musical, one of the longest running in Broadway history, readers have been entertained for years with dozens of best-selling re-imaging tales from the worlds of Oz, Dickens, The Nutcracker, and now Hans Christian Andersen. Let there be no misunderstanding. Books by this unconventional genius are for adult readers. We could take up all our allotted time ranting and raving about our past successes with Wicked, Hidden Sea, After Alice, Son of a Witch, A Lion Among Men, Out of Oz, Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister, Mirror, Mirror, and on and on. However, we're here today to let the world know about A Wild Winter Swan and why you will absolutely devour this delicious read and cherish owning a signed first edition. Before we dive into the storyline, Gregoey, will you please share the genesis which you attribute to P.L. Travers, the author of Mary Poppins?
I used to live in London, England, about 25 years ago. Indeed, the very year that Wicked, my novel, was coming out for the first time, 25 years ago, I wrote to the author of Mary Poppins, P.L. Travers, who lived off the King's Road in the part of London called Chelsea. I was writing her ostensibly to meet her so I could see if she was healthy enough and vigorous enough to entertain an invitation to speak at a conference in England that I was running. She wrote back to me immediately in a very quavery hand and said, "Come to tea next Tuesday at 4. So one doesn't disobey the order, command appearance by the author of Mary Poppins. So at 4 o'clock, I showed up on the doorstep of her small home, and I was let in by an assistant. P.L. Travers sat in a corner in an overstuffed chair, looking very frail and a little confused. When I came through the door and presented myself, she said, "Oh, you've come to read the meters. The meters are in the kitchen, through the door, that way." And I said, "Miss Travers, I've come to have tea. You wrote to me to invite me for tea." And she said, "I always give tea to the meter man, but why would you like to talk to me?" And I told her, "I've long admired your books." And we set to immediately in a literary discussion. She was very fond of her own work. And I say that with not meaning any disgrace upon her head, because she did fabulous and important work for all of us. But at one point, toward the end of the conversation, after she had signed a few books of mine, she said, "What other stories are you interested in?" Because I had told her a little bit about Wicked and my story taking up the Wicked Witch of the West. Miss Travers was greatly interested in fairy tales and mythology from all over the world. And she said, as a kind of a throwaway comment, "You know that story about the boy with the swan wing? Give him something to do. And now the meters need reading, so you should get along." So I did not ever read the meters because I'm not a meter man, but I wrote down that phrase and I wrote down everything I could remember about the meeting after I had left her doorstep. And many years later, almost 25 years later, I came across those notes and thought, I wonder if this was an instruction, not just advice, but I wonder if she was giving me a job to do. And I decided that it was true and that I had to fulfill her request of me to give the Swan brother something to do.
Well, the world owes a debt of gratitude to that lady. We're so delighted she put the spark to you. Gregory, set the stage for this haunting tale by describing Laura, the protagonist.
Yes, I will, Jake. Laura is a 15-year-old child living with her grandparents in a fairly pricey area of Manhattan. The year is 1962. It's the Christmas season right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So some people who are listening or watching might not yet have been born. I myself was a small child during that season, but I was old enough to remember it a little bit. Laura is an unhappy child because her father is dead and her mother is off stage, suffering a kind of mental breakdown. So she has been living with her grandparents in a townhouse in the Upper East Side that, frankly, the grandparents can't really afford. The grandparents are financially stretched and anxious. And as the story begins, Laura has just been expelled from high school for some bad behavior, some behavior unbecoming of a young woman, you might say. And so as the Christmas season descends upon the household, Laura is being threatened with being sent away to a convent school in Montreal, while her grandparents fret about losing their business and their home in much the same way they lost their son right after World War II. So Laura is not what you'd call the fleetest arrow in the quiver. And I don't mean any disrespect to people who find academics hard in that comment. It's true. Some of us are glib and can do schoolwork without even taking a break. Others of us have to really struggle. And Laura is a struggler. She has trouble with words and she has trouble with social friendships. So she's really in the most crowded city in the world in 1962. Laura is a true isolate. She's very lonely and she's about to be evicted and evacuated from her grandparents' home just as the story begins.
That young lady has a load to carry. Thinking about it, many of us have loads during this pandemic, and this book is a wonderful escape. Without giving anything away, was the owl a subtle clue of the coming arrival of the swan?
There is an owl who shows up in the first chapter of the book. And I think, Jake, you're a good reader, because I was trying to prime the reader's mind to think this is going to be a story of interruptions. I mean, you might find an owl, a baby owl on the street fallen out of its nest. Indeed, once I did in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I actually had the experience of taking care of it for 3 or 4 days until it strengthened and it flew away. So that part is from real life. But for an owl to come out of the ceiling, it's not what one expects. So a ceiling is a conventional margin of reality. We have our walls, we have our floor, we have our ceiling. When something breaks through the actual perimeter of reality and appears in a place and in a way in which we don't expect it, we know trouble's afoot. And yes, Jake, indeed, the owl is just a kind of a presage of what is to come in Laura's life in the next 3 or 4 days.
And what about when Laura was reading stories to the younger kids and decided to close the book and just tell the story about the swan, or when Laura was drawing the picture from the World Book Encyclopedia?
No, I think it was exactly a clue for Laura to have to tell in her own words the story, Hans Christian Andersen's story of the wild swans. Now, Jake, I suspect you would agree with me. Feel free to disagree if you do disagree. That while Hans Christian Andersen wrote several hundred stories, there are only a handful that we still know really well. We know The Emperor's New Clothes. We know The Ugly Duckling. We know The Little Mermaid. We might know The Little Match Girl. The Wild Swans is right on the margin of what we remember. We remember the images more than we remember the actual plot. So that was very useful for me as a storyteller, because I thought, all I really need is the image of this boy with one swan wing swooping as best he can, swooping into Laura's life. I need to show where he came from so that he's just not like a terrifying nightmare. He comes from story. But I didn't need to make an exact parallel to that story, because we don't hold that story in every particular in our narrative imaginations. I think that's my feeling anyway. Am I right in that?
We may disagree in other areas, but we do agree on this after the fact. I took those passages as clues.
Well, that's good, and I do think it is an arresting image, and of the boy with one swan wing, and I don't know if you know the work of the brilliant writer and artist Brian Selznick, whose book The Invention of Hugo Cabret was made into a fine film called Hugo, about the boy in the clock tower in a train station in Paris in about 1915 or 1920 or something. Anyway, Brian Selznick, Caldecott-winning artist, and I had lunch one time about 3 years ago, and we both confessed that we had loved that story as boys, reading through the fairy tales. A lot of the fairy tales went over our head or out the back door, but the image of the boy with one swan wing really arrested us and stayed with both of us. I think it's both a scary thing to imagine and a haunting thing and an attractive thing in a certain way.
I think that conversation you and Brian had is a great lead-in to on a dark and stormy night. There was a noise outside Laura's window, and the main drama begins. We hope fans of Hans Christian Andersen enjoyed his version of A Wild Winter Swan, as we know your readers will. And he didn't have a pandemic to escape. May we ask you to share Laura's discovery?
Yes, I will. Laura had gone to bed. Her grandparents live a floor below her, and they're too infirm to make it up the very steep final flight of steps to the attic. So they call goodnight to her from down below. Good night, Laura. And she goes upstairs, and she can't sleep because she's fretting so. She tosses and turns, and then in the middle of the storm, she hears a wild thump upon the mansard roof outside her windows. She runs to the window, opens it up, and she's not sure if it's what it could be. A tree, maybe uprooted by the winds and cast like a hurricane, up on the fourth floor of a Manhattan townhouse. That couldn't be. She finds a figure, a boy, roughly her own age, maybe a little older, huddled and speechless and covered with ice and snow. And she helps him into the window where he can get warm. And as he falls into the window from the fourth floor, ledge outside her window, she sees that he has one arm replaced with the wing of a swan. So the figure that she has read about to the kindergarten kids has come actually into her life, landed on her roof, and she has welcomed him against all protocols, I might add, in 1962 and probably today. She has welcomed him onto her floor in her grandparents' house.
Okay, now the swan has arrived, but the drama does not stop. Ovid Ciardi, the grandpa, still needs an investment from his wealthy brother-in-law. The cook faces an almost insurmountable task in pulling off an impressive banquet, and Laura still faces being shipped off to Montreal. Her former arch-enemy, now best friend Maxime, is enlisted to help repair a damaged swan wing. Whew! Gregory, take it from there without, again, giving anything away, and give us a preview of what we should expect.
Yes. Of course, I don't want to give too much away because I want to make the book appealing for people to buy and to read and to give away as presents. But I will say that if you remember, and I know you do, Jake, because you've read it, Laura is not. She doesn't think quickly. She is deliberative, and she is not confident. She's probably smarter than she knows, but she's not yet confident. Confidence comes to all of us on a separate, individualized schedule, if it comes to us at all. And Laura has not yet reached that moment in her life where she is in charge of her own powers. But this is a problem she has to deal with anyway. So she corrals her former enemy into, and also a young man who's been working around the house, trying to fix the house up to be impressive for the guests when they arrive on Christmas Eve. She corrals those two people to help her in her strategy to give the Swan boy an exit plan. She knows he can't stay there. She can't harbor him for good. It's probably illegal, and by the rubrics of her parents' faith, it's probably immoral too. She knows she's in hot water here, and it's more than she can really. It's more than she's ready to take on. She's not yet developmentally ready to have a boy in the house, as it were. She's stuck in a moral conundrum. But so she does the best she can by trying to devise an exit strategy, if you will, for her uninvited guest. And I'm not going to tell how she invents that, because that's part of the point of the book. But her intentions are good, even if her logic doesn't always sit on all four legs. It's a little wobbly.
Gregory, we are honored to have you visit remotely, and hope that when this virus goes away, you might make it to Alabama in person for your next book.
I would love to do that, Jake. And I will come back to one thing you said several times at the beginning, which was how pertinent the story of Laura sort of boxed into her home and not knowing what's going to come next. How pertinent this story is for the time in which we find ourselves in October 2020. We are all trying to take care of ourselves and our loved ones. We are, most of us, circumscribed a little bit in our ability to travel and move about and to maintain the same patterns of behavior that we so enjoyed without thinking about it 9 months ago. The comfort that comes from realizing that young people especially have always faced challenges of being trapped and kind of ignorant about the world outside the parameters of their own life experience. We can derive comfort from reading. We can derive comfort from knowing fictionally that we're not alone. When we pick up a book, it doesn't need to be my book, though I'm happy if it is. When we pick up a book and realize this character is experiencing in a magical form something that I'm experiencing in an emotional way, and there are more similarities between us than there are differences. That's, I think, the virtue, the nutrition, and the therapy of fiction. And so I'm really glad, Jake, that you mentioned that this is a comfort book in a way, like mashed potatoes. It's a comfort book for a difficult time. So I really appreciate being welcomed into the author spotlight of the Alabama Booksmith, and for you to have read so carefully and appreciatively A Wild Winter Swan.
This is probably poor manners when the ink is still wet on your new book to ask what's next, but what's next?
Well, I will tell you this. I have a new book that is just being signed up to my publisher. And yet my publisher says, I forbid you to talk about it until we have a press release. So I'm afraid I'm just going to have to say, watch this space. Stay tuned, everybody. There is something else coming down the pike, perhaps as early as a year from now.
Gregory Maguire, thank you for this warm, fuzzy story. Thank you for your time, and thank you for signing all our books. Stay safe, and our best to Andy, Alex, Helen, and Luke.
You're so kind, and thank you for having me, and I do hope to meet you in person when the pandemic restrictions lift. It would be something to lift my heart to think about.
To purchase the first edition of A Wild Winter Swan signed by Gregory Maguire, visit alabamabooksmith.com.